creating TBEST application scenarios using the TBEST network editor. So in this particular section, we'll talk about what's an application scenario and when is it most often used, what if planning applications and TDP development using TBEST scenarios, data inputs for scenario development, workflow information on how to create a scenario within TBEST, application scenario development procedures. So we talked a bit about already our setup of our scenarios. And so we now have our June 2021 base read-only scenario. We've also created our fall 2021 scenario. So we already have an application scenario that we've constructed, bringing in our GTFS for it. So right away, we have both a base and an alternative scenario to work with. So in terms of what types of scenarios can you create for planning? Obviously, for the transit development plans, you have a 10-year plan, the base condition assessment, which is essentially our fall 2021 service change, our future alternatives development, which are our 2030 or other alternative year implementation of our network. And we use all for estimating transit demand, future network summaries, and BRT and premium transit studies. So in terms of comprehensive operations analysis, we can look at new routes that we might want to implement in the short term, or either in realigning routes or consolidating routes, schedule changes, stop amenity analysis, and doing service guideline evaluation. Of course, a lot of tools that you have in TBEST can be used for area corridor studies, mobility studies, obviously Title VI triennial reporting and disparate impact analysis, and grant evaluation and testing. These are kind of the cornerstone items that we would have, but as I mentioned in the opening, we still view TBEST as a Swiss Army knife of transit planning. So even if you have something that's out of the box that doesn't meet this exact regimen, usually TBEST can get you there in terms of data processing as an interim step to go maybe process in a third-party application or outside of TBEST, and then get your final product. So just as a review, our application scenarios for TDP support, where we can do transit demand estimation, land use market analysis, socioeconomic market analysis, and basically how all of this is tied to the TDP handbook. So in terms of what if scenarios, this is basically what TBEST allows you to test in a what if type of scenario, where you would want to ask questions of TBEST and have it fill in transit service data gaps to meet those needs. So in terms of an example, what if might be what the ridership impact might be if you service is reduced or increased by 30%. What if the operating hours are extended? What if you realign a route and serve a different corridor, you add new Sunday service, or you grow the socioeconomic data in the service area? So all of those are things that can be tested both with the ridership estimation, but also the other tools as well in terms of accessibility in the network, what you might be able to get to if you make service changes relative to the base. So those are additional tools that you can use to do comparative analysis as well, and what if analysis. So one of the things that the model can produce for you is how does a service change impact performance? So clearly one of the items that you want to investigate is the change to performance. Once you input your service change, does it impact performance? And TBEST can tell you that through the comparative analysis tools that we'll discover tomorrow. What is the estimate of number of direct and transfer boardings on a new line? So certainly one of the great things that TBEST does is that it separates direct and transfer boardings into their own equations. And that way you have an estimate of both. And you can also say, tell where these direct and transfer boardings were happening on a stop-by-stop basis. If we are considering BRT, what is an estimate of ridership that we might expect versus traditional bus? And so that's something directly that TBEST can do. We talked about the BRT tool and how it actually escalates the base ridership on a route relative to the implementation level of the BRT. And scenarios can represent service modifications expected in 0 to 10-year time frame, and that includes every year in between. So if you're doing staggered implementation of a service plan over a 10-year period, you can look at each implementation year and see what is expected in terms of ridership and production in each year if you want to go to that level. So TBEST application data collection. So there are specification with these studies to serve as input to develop TBEST application scenarios. In general, TBEST application scenario will require the following data inputs: the implementation year of the proposed service change. So certainly that's something we would set in the scenario properties. A list of new, removed, or modified routes with proposed service level changes. So if you're not importing from a GTFS and you're doing the data development and service change inside of TBEST, prior to actually performing the change, you're going to need to know what to do. So in the TDP or the COA plan, you should have some level of knowledge as to what might be implemented, and you can go ahead and make those changes inside of TBEST and then test the efficacy of those changes with ridership estimation, et cetera. Operating speeds for new routes, any fare changes you might want for an application scenario, socioeconomic growth from the TAZ or other system level growth rates. So this is just a few things that you can implement either together as one scenario, or you can separate them out in separate scenarios to see individual impacts on each one of these changes that you might want to implement. So in the TBEST appendix, user guide, the user guide appendix D is a model application scenario checklist that is a pretty nice reference for you to look at to document what you might want to put into an application scenario, and so that you can refer back to it at any time. So it's actually kind of a hard copy list of changes that you want to make to a scenario so that you write them all down, and then you know from that piece of paper what you actually implemented in a scenario. So that's just a reference for you. You can print that out and use it at will, but it's there in Appendix D of the user guide. So step 4 is really the critical piece here, where you're developing the application scenario network, including all of what we talked about. In the end, step 5, before you actually run the model, you want to review the route validation collections to verify that the modified routes are in a collection consistent with the validation. So what that means is if you have a route 5 in the base year, and you have a route 5A and 5B in your forecast year because you've split them up. Well, TBEST doesn't really know that 5A and 5B are actually what used to be 5. So what you will need to do is put them into the correct validation collection, which would be route 5, but you'll have to do that manually. Now, if you modified route 5 and you didn't change the name, then TBEST would recognize that name consistency and put them into the correct collection. But if you split them up and they don't have the same name, then TBEST really doesn't know. So you have to manually put them into a fitting collection. By and large, though, all of your new routes that you would create do not need to be in a route validation collection. They actually should be outside of it. So it can take that average adjustment factor and apply it. But if it is a split up route, then you'll need to manually put that in. So once you have your network scenario developed, your validation collections kind of verified, you run the TBEST model, and then you just look at the results and report out the results. So that's the general context for this. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a couple of scenarios and then work with those going forward. Okay, so let's move into our exercise mode here. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to close out of my fall 2021 scenario. I'm just going to click the close scenario button in the upper right-hand corner, and that will close that scenario. Okay, so 6.0 TBEST application scenarios exercise step 1. create the 2030 no build application scenario. So in TBEST Explorer, navigate to the scenarios folder under the Gatorville Transit System, right click on the fall 2021 and copy it. So let's right click on fall 2021 and select copy. We're going to call this new scenario that we're creating via a copy TDP 2030 no build. And we're going to set the description to be TDP 2030 10-year no build TDP scenario. TDP's in there. Now we're going to set the forecast year to be 2030. So that's an important piece to this. And our wage growth rate is still at 1%, so that's fine. Okay, so everything else looks okay to me. So what we can do is just click the OK button when we're ready. And that will copy our fall 2021. So all the GTFS we just imported and we revised that network is now resident in our 2030 no build scenario. So the next step is step 2, set the socioeconomic growth rates on the 2030 no build application scenario. So for our no build scenario, we're going to right click on it and select socioeconomic growth rates. Okay, and so what happens here is we did populate this, if you remember already, in one of our original scenarios. We set all these references to the zonal data for 2045, referenced all this information, set this. So automatically it pops up again. So essentially all we need to do here is set the growth rates because all of our selections are still true. We're still referencing this data, 2045. All of this is still the same. All we want to do is recalculate the growth rates for this scenario. So let's hit set growth rates and say yes. And that is updated, so great. So let's move on to step 3, create the 2030 network application scenario. So in TBEST Explorer, again, we're going to make a copy of the no build this time. So we're going to make a copy of no build and we're going to call it TDP 2030. It's our scenario name. And it's going to be the TDP 2030 10-year TDP scenario. And again, our forecast year is 2030, which is fine. We already have that implemented, and 1% annual growth rate for our mean annual wage. So if I'm going too fast, y'all can ping me and tell me to slow down. But I'll hang out here for 5 seconds just in case someone wants me to pull it up. Okay, so we're all good here. We're going to create our TDP 2030 and say okay, and that will create yet another scenario. So what we're doing here is what we're kind of building. So we're taking what we implemented in fall 2021 and well, actually we started with June 2021. We copied that, imported the GTFS for the 2021, fall 2021. We copied that and made it a 2030 scenario, no build scenario. So we set the growth rates on it. So essentially that's what we want also for our TDP 2030 network scenario. We're going to actually start changing it. So we're kind of building off all of our previous steps that we did so that we have to repeat them in different scenarios. So you notice that's kind of the trend here. All right, so our last step here, exercise step 4, is to run the ridership estimation model for the 2030 no build scenario. So, so that is just right-clicking on 2030 no build, selecting ridership forecasting model, and all of the options should be fine. And all we should need to do is click the run model button. So that will take it into a model run, and from there we will move on to our next steps in the slides.